It was the kind of evening when bad things happen. 5 years on, and Officer Daniel Carter had come to realize that. The storm, the darkness, the eerie silence of the streets. These were the nights when people disappeared, when accidents occurred, when the world seemed to forget the most vulnerable. But tonight, the victim had no name. It was something much smaller, much weaker, and all alone. Daniel was on his normal patrol, the wipers of his cruiser working overtime to keep up with the torrential rain. His shift was almost complete, a few more blocks and he could go home for the night. But then, that sound, a whimper. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, merely the wind howling through the alleyways. But then it returned, softly, frailly, desperately. His stomach tightened. Daniel eased the car to a stop as he peered down empty streets. His headlights pierced the darkness, lighting up the drenched pavement and deserted storefronts. Then a small something caught his sight. At the end of an alleyway, partially hidden in the shadows, sat a small, shivering ball of fur. His breath caught. Instinctively, he threw the car into park and stepped out. The cold rain soaked through his uniform instantly, but he didn't mind. His attention was all for that small, fragile thing shivering there on the ground. It was a puppy, and it wasn't moving. Daniel's heart raced as he knelt next to it. The poor thing was drenched to the bone, its little ribs showing through the wet fur. Its eyes, barely opened, fixed on him with a look that sent a shiver down his spine. Not from the cold, but from something else, something deeper. "Jesus, what happened to you?" he said softly, touching his hand tentatively. At first, the puppy flinched, but then it did something surprising. With what little strength it had left, it crept forward and forced its tiny head against his hand. That was all it took. Daniel lifted the puppy, cradling it against his chest like a delicate glass bauble. It was so cold, its tiny body shivering with fatigue. "You're okay now, buddy. I got you." The puppy let out a soft sigh, as if it finally believed it. Daniel hurried back to his car, thoughts racing. He had a choice to make: call animal control and leave it to destiny, or take matters into his own hands. He didn't even hesitate. He activated the siren and sped toward the closest vet clinic. What he didn't realize was that this was just the beginning, because within a few hours, when the vet scanned for a microchip, the truth would render him utterly speechless. Those 5 words reverberated in Daniel's mind. The receptionist's face was white. It wasn't just concern in the way she was looking at the Chihuahua. It was fear, and Daniel had no idea why. The emergency response. Before he could answer questions, the doors to the exam room burst open. A middle-aged veterinarian in a slightly wrinkled white coat came rushing out. His name tag said Dr. Reynolds. "Where is it?" he said, his voice sharper than Daniel had expected. The receptionist gestured toward the Chihuahua, still wrapped in Daniel's jacket, barely moving. Reynolds froze. His eyes flickered over the dog, his face going through a transformation from professional to something totally different. Shock. Then he looked toward the nurse who was standing nearby. "Prep an isolation room. Now." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Isolation? What are you talking about?" The vet didn't answer. He just reached out and took the Chihuahua from Daniel's arms. And the second he did, the dog twitched. Not a normal movement. Something unnatural. A shudder that shook its small frame. Too smooth, too controlled. Daniel's pulse spiked. "Wait, what's happening? What's wrong with him?" But Reynolds didn't respond. He was already sprinting toward the back room. And Daniel, he was abandoned with nothing except questions. The waiting game. Minutes passed, then 15, then 30. Daniel waited in the waiting room, kicking the floor with restless feet. People came and went. Dogs barked off in the background, but no one told him anything. And the more he delayed, the worse his instincts became. This wasn't normal. An ill-strayed dog was not transferred to an isolation room. However trained a vet may be, a starving Chihuahua shouldn't have been the one to leave him pale. And yet, here he was, waiting, wondering, dreading. And then, the back door swung open and slammed. The test results. Dr. Reynolds came, but something was wrong. His usual detached, professional manner was absent. Instead, he moved stiffly, cautious, like he was witnessing something he didn't want to see. Daniel stood immediately. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Is he okay?" Reynolds hesitated. Then he exhaled. "You need to come with me." The microchip that should not exist. The exam room was cold. The Chihuahua lay on the table, now plugged into an IV, his tiny body rising and falling in steady rhythm. Still weak, still fragile, but alive. Daniel sighed in relief. "Okay, good. But why all the secrecy? What's going on?" Reynolds didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked to a monitor and brought up an image. It was a microchip scan. Daniel frowned. "Okay. Most dogs have chips." Reynolds looked at him, dark-eyed. "Not like this one." Daniel's stomach tightened. The image showed a code. But it wasn't just numbers. It was a 20-character alphanumeric string. And next to it, a classification. Restricted. Daniel blinked. "What does that mean?" Reynolds shook his head. "I don't know. But I do know this. This is not a typical pet microchip. It's government-issued." Daniel stared. "Wait, what? That doesn't make sense. He's just a stray." Reynolds gazed at him intently. "Are you sure about that?" The call that altered everything. Reynolds snatched Daniel's phone before he could answer. His fingers were dialing fast, his expression grim. Heart racing, Daniel watched and waited. Who was he calling? Then, "Yeah, it's me. We have another one." Daniel's stomach dropped. "Another one? What the hell did that mean?" Reynolds looked away, lowering his voice, urgency in it. "Yes, same markings, same chip format. No, stable subject, but I don't know for how long. We need—" Then the phone cut off. Static filled the room. Reynolds retracted the device on a frown. Then all the lights flickered. Daniel felt a shiver of dread. This was no ordinary power surge. Something was happening. And then the Chihuahua had opened his eyes. The impossible sight, Daniel's breath hitched. The tiny dog blinked once, and then his pupils shifted. For a split second, just a fraction of a second, they weren't normal. They were not the dark, round eyes of a Chihuahua. They were something else, silver, reflective, unnatural, like metal, as if they were not quite real. Daniel stumbled back. "What the—" The Chihuahua's eyes returned to the normal position immediately. But Daniel knew what he had seen, and judging by how still Reynolds had gone, so had he. The room fell silent in deafening silence. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. And then a car screeched outside. Daniel flinched. Headlights flickered through the clinic's front window. A black SUV had just arrived. And Daniel knew, whoever they weren't here for a checkup. Daniel's mind raced. The shine from the Chihuahua's gaze, the government microchip, the way Dr. Reynolds froze when the lights flickered. And now, a black SUV had just parked outside. Not a coincidence, not a mistake. They were here for the dog, and Daniel had no idea why. The shadows at the door. It was Reynolds who made the first move. His fists were clenched. He glanced at Daniel, then at the front door. Outside, two shapes emerged from the SUV. They both wore black suits, no badges, no IDs. They weren't police. They weren't animal control. They were something else. And that scared Daniel more than anything. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "Listen to me, and listen carefully." Daniel turned his eyes from the window. "What's going on?" he demanded. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "You need to get out of here, now." The unexpected order. Daniel stared. "What? Reynolds grabbed his wrist. His grip was firm, urgent. "Take the dog and go right now." Daniel's pulse spiked. "But no time," Reynolds hissed. "They're coming for him. And if they take him, you will never see him again. You don't want that." Daniel's breath caught. "Why? Who are they?" Reynolds paused for just the briefest moment. And that told Daniel all he needed to know. The vet was holding back more than he was saying. But before Daniel could drive home the point, the clinic's front door opened. The men in black. The two men stepped inside. Their suits were sharp, no nonsense. Their expressions flat, empty. Daniel didn't know if they were placid or dangerous, maybe both. Reynolds squared his shoulders. "Can I help you?" His tone was businesslike, restrained. The tall one, broad shoulders, hard eyes, the man said, "We're here for the animal." Not a chihuahua, not a stray, the animal. Like he was something, not someone. Daniel's stomach twisted. Reynolds didn't even blink. "I'm sorry, but before I release any animal from my care, you will have to provide documentation." The second man, shorter, thinner, and with a more disturbingly blank stare, stepped forward. "We're not asking. The turn that makes all the difference." Daniel's heartbeat pounded. He knew what was happening. He could feel it. These men were not here to assist. They were not here to reclaim a lost dog. They were here to unwrite something, to remove evidence, and the Chihuahua, if they took him, there'd be no more of him. Daniel balled his hands into fists. "What do you do with him if you take him?" he demanded. Both men turned toward him, as if they had only just discovered he was there. The expression on the taller one's face remained unchanged. "Those details are classified." Daniel's chest tightened. "You're not taking him." The words slipped from his mouth before he could unsay them. A silence followed. Reynolds squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, like he had an idea of what was going to happen next. The shorter agent sighed. "We had hoped to do this quietly." Then he pretended to reach for something under his jacket. The vet's last move. Daniel's heart stopped. "Gun!" his brain screamed. But before he could react, Reynolds moved, faster than Daniel expected. The vet lunged for a metal tray on the counter and swung it violently. The blow crashed into the agent's wrist, sending whatever he had been reaching for crashing to the ground. The metallic clink rang in diverse corridors of the hospital. Chaos erupted. Daniel didn't think, didn't question. He snatched the Chihuahua from the table and fled. The escape begins. Reynolds yelled something after him, but Daniel was already running down the hallway. The Chihuahua was warm and quaking against his chest. Daniel's mind raced. Think, think, think. There was one thing he knew. The front door was out. So that left the back exit. Daniel ran through the doors, down the hallway as fast as he could toward the emergency exit. Behind him, voices yelled, then a gunshot. The bullet broke some glass nearby. Daniel ducked instinctively. His ears rang, but he kept running, kept moving, because if he stopped, they would take the dog. And something in Daniel's gut told him that would never happen. The final moments. The emergency exit swung open with a bang. Daniel walked into the back alley of the clinic. Cold air hit his face. Darkness stretched ahead. And for a brief moment, he dared to hope. Then, an SUV screamed around the corner. Daniel's stomach dropped. They had made this prediction already. They had already cut him off. Daniel gripped the Chihuahua harder. His mind raced. He had nowhere left to run. And that's when he heard it. A low hum, faint at first, coming from the Chihuahua. Daniel looked down, and his breath caught. The Chihuahua was glowing for sure again. But this time, it wasn't his eyes. It was his entire body. Daniel hardly had time to react when everything went white. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no weight, no time. Just a never-ending, white-hot, blinding nothingness. Daniel couldn't breathe, not because he was suffocating, but because he couldn't be sure that his body even still existed. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it ended. Back to reality, or something. Daniel gasped. Air rushed into his lungs. His eyes refocused. The searing white faded to blackness. And just like that, he was back in the alleyway. His knees buckled. He collapsed forward, panting, his palms hitting the cold pavement. His arms cradled the limp Chihuahua. Still warm, still breathing. But his glow, gone. Daniel's heart hammered. What in the hell just happened? The men in black, gone. Daniel's gaze flicked to the street ahead. The SUV that had cut off his escape. Gone. The gunmen, nowhere in sight. Only the distant hum of the city interrupted the silence. No sirens, no shouts. It was as if they never were there at all. Daniel's chest tightened. No, that's not possible. I saw them. I heard the gunshot. And yet, there was no broken glass, no damage. He had nothing to show that just minutes prior he had been trapped. It was as if the world had simply rebooted. The Chihuahua stirs. Then, a soft whimper. Daniel looked away. His eyes dropped down. The body of the Chihuahua twitched. His eyes fluttered open. For a brief second, they glowed again. Faint. Barely noticeable. But Daniel saw it, and he knew. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was not a mere government experiment. This was something completely different. The only choice left. Daniel managed to get to his feet. His muscles ached. His head was still spinning, but he couldn't stay here. Whoever those men had been, they were not gone for good. And when they came back, they would not give him another chance to run. He drew the Chihuahua in tighter. All right, buddy. I don't know what just happened, but we got to go. The dog blinked up at him, like he understood. Daniel exhaled. He only had one person to turn to now. The only person who could have answers. Dr. Reynolds, and if the vet was alive, Daniel was going to find him. For the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel felt completely alone. The men in black were gone. No bodies, no cars, no evidence that they were ever there. The one piece of evidence of what had transpired, the little Chihuahua in his arms, alive, but so fundamentally changed. And Daniel was beginning to understand. He was different now. The streets feel wrong. The city was too quiet. Not ordinary late-night silence. Oops. A wrong kind of silence. No cars, no voices, no flickering streetlights. As if the world was frozen in time. Daniel wrapped his jacket tightly around the Chihuahua and continued walking. He had no plan at all. Just a final destination. Dr. Reynolds. If anyone could explain what the hell just happened, it was him. If he was still alive. The clinic, but different. Daniel rounded the last corner, his breath catching. The clinic was still there, but something was off. The front door was slightly ajar. No flashing police lights, no crime scene tape. Just nothing. As if nobody had even looked at that place. Daniel's heart pounded. Something was wrong. He stepped forward, pushed the door open slowly, and then he froze. The aftermath. The clinic was a wreck. Cabinets had been flung open. Papers littered the floor. But there was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No broken glass. Just emptiness. Like someone had searched the place methodically, purposely. Daniel's stomach twisted. They cleaned up. No sign of the men in black. No sign of Reynolds. Not even an indication that anything happened, like they had erased it. Like they had erased him. A hidden message. Then, movement. Daniel spun, fists clenched. But it wasn't a person. It was a blinking red light. A single flashing dot on one of the overturned monitors. Daniel hesitated. Then he stepped closer. The screen was shattered, but he could still use it. One message lit up across it. One sentence. One warning. If you found this, run. Daniel's blood turned to ice. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And now, they were coming for him. The words blared ominously from the cracked screen. Daniel stared, his breath shallow, his pulse thundering. How this message came about was due to someone leaving it. Someone who knew what lay ahead. And now, Daniel had a matter of seconds to choose his next step. The unseen presence, a quiet whimper, yanked him back to the present. The Chihuahua. Whimpering and still tucked against his chest, still breathing. But Daniel sensed it. There was something different about the dog now. Ever since the alleyway, ever since the world had turned unfathomably white. Daniel gritted his teeth. All right, think. He had two choices. Run, take the dog and disappear, stay, look for more clues. The screen kept blinking, as if it was challenging him to not. And Daniel? He was not the type of guy who did not want to answer. The search for clues, Daniel gathered speed, scanning the wreck. The clinic had been looted, but not like a robbery. It was too precise. Files missing. Computers wiped. All of the access to the Chihuahua's records gone. Whoever was behind this wasn't just covering their ass. They were erasing history. And that meant one thing. This wasn't the first time such a thing had occurred, and it wouldn't be the last. A single surviving file. Daniel's hands shook as he turned over a toppled cabinet, and then he saw it, a flash drive, all but covered by a collection of scattered papers. His heart pounded. Someone had missed it. The evidence hadn't all been erased by whoever had erased it. Daniel snatched it up. Then, a noise. A soft, deliberate click. And just like that, Daniel knew he was not alone. They're here. A shadow flickered by the door. Daniel's breath hitched. Footsteps echoed gently in the clinic. Steady. Controlled. A voice came after. Steady. Patient. Mr. Carter, I was hoping you'd be smarter than this. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew that voice. He'd heard this at the vet's office back then. One of the men in black. Daniel turned at his own pace and stared into the eyes of the tall agent he had seen earlier. Still in that same black suit. Still unreadable, but this time, he wasn't alone. Two more men flanked him, expressionless, blocking the only exit. Daniel wrapped his fingers around the flash drive. The Chihuahua roused in his lap. And the agent? He smiled. Just give us the dog and all of this will end. The choice that makes all the difference. Daniel's heart raced. He had seconds to react. He felt the weight of the flash drive in his palm. The Chihuahua's tiny chest rises and falls. The men had no weapons, not out in the open. But Daniel wasn't stupid. They didn't need guns. They were the weapon. His grip tightened. You're not taking him. The agent sighed. I was hoping you didn't say that. Then he raised his hand, not a gun, not a taser, just his bare palm. And in that moment, Daniel sensed a change in the air, a sudden pressure, an unseen force, and then his vision blurred. The world breaks again. The room tilted. Daniel's limbs went weak. His skull ached as if something were pushing inside his head. Like an unseen tide breaking over his body, he tried to move, tried to fight it, but his body wouldn't listen. The Chihuahua whined in his arms. The agent's voice rang in his head, loud and clear. "You can't win this, Daniel." Daniel's jaw clenched. His vision darkened. The last thing he saw was the agent coming up to him, reaching for the dog, and Daniel unable to stop it. The words banged around in his skull, not through sound, but through something else, something deeper, something inside him. Daniel gritted his teeth. The pressure he felt, crushing, overwhelming, not on his body, on his mind. The agent wasn't exactly giving a lecture. He was inside Daniel's head. And the worst part? Daniel couldn't stop him. A fight he can't see. The room twisted. Daniel's knees buckled. The floor felt miles away. His vision cleaved into two sides at once, one where he was standing in the ruined clinic facing the agents, and one where he wasn't there, a place he had never seen, but somehow a place that felt familiar. He saw a laboratory, glass walls, a metallic table, rows of small cages, and inside them, dogs. Not normal dogs. Dogs like the Chihuahua. Tiny bodies, glowing eyes, and the very same government chips tucked inside their flesh. Daniel's stomach twisted. He was not merely seeing a vision. He was seeing the past. The experiment revealed, Daniel implored, holding his head. "What the hell is this?" The agent's voice was calm, amused. "You know already, don't you?" Daniel saw it now. The truth he'd been unwilling to confront. The Chihuahua, he wasn't an experiment. He was the last living remnant of something grander. It turned out the government hadn't only been making super dogs. They had been building another something. And now they wanted their invention back. Back to reality, just in time, Daniel snapped back. The clinic surged back into focus. His knees were jelly, but he found a way to stay up. He clutched the Chihuahua tighter. The agents were eyeballing him closely, studying him, like he was a lab rat too, and maybe he was, because if they got into his head once, they could do it again, and Daniel wasn't going to allow that to happen. The Chihuahua fights back. The Chihuahua stiffened in his arms. Daniel felt it instantly, a shift, a hum in the air. The dog was awake now, and this time, he was ready. Before the agents could respond, the Chihuahua moved. Not physically, not by running or jumping, but by doing something else. That shouldn't have been possible. A small pulse of energy shot out from his petite body, invisible to the eye, but Daniel felt it, and so did the agents, because in an instant, they froze. The agents can't move. Daniel's heart pounded. The men in black stood rigid, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly open, as if they had been frozen in place, stuck in their own heads. Daniel gasped. "What did you do?" The Chihuahua didn't answer, didn't even blink. But Daniel knew. He had glimpsed these agents in his head, and now the Chihuahua was in theirs. The only chance to escape, Daniel didn't waste time. He spun around and bolted for the rear exit. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he kept running, because it was no longer just about escaping. It was about getting to the truth, about the real thing that was the Chihuahua, after why the government was so eager to retrieve him, and about what came next. Because if there was one lesson Daniel learned tonight, it was that this isn't merely a fight for survival. This was what was early on, unbeknownst to the people involved, the start of something much bigger. Daniel's legs burned. His lungs shrieked for breath as he ran down the alleyway, the Chihuahua wrapped tightly in his arms. He didn't look back. Didn't dare to, because whatever the Chihuahua had just done, it wasn't permanent. For now, the agents had been frozen. But they didn't always stay that way, and when they broke free, they'd come for him. But this time, they wouldn't repeat the same mistake. The city feels wrong. The streets were empty, too empty. Daniel had grown up in the city his entire life. There were always people, even at 3 a.m., a late-night jogger, a cab driver, someone walking back home from a bar. But now, nothing. Just street lights buzzing softly. Just the distant bass of traffic, more distant than it ought to be. That the world had moved over a half an inch to the left. Like he was somewhere he knew, but wasn't sure. Daniel's stomach twisted. Did they do this? Had the men in black somehow cleaned up the area? Or was it something worse? Maybe something about the Chihuahua? The dog stirs. A faint whimper, Daniel slowed, glancing down. The Chihuahua's eyelids fluttered open, not glowing this time, just normal, like any other dog. Daniel swallowed. "You okay, buddy?" The Chihuahua looked up at him and blinked. And then he licked Daniel's hand, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just mentally shut down 3 government agents. Daniel gasped, a shaking breath. Right, cool, totally normal dog. But deep down, he knew this was not normal in any way, and he needed answers, fast. The only safe place left. Daniel's mind raced. The clinic was compromised. Reynolds was missing. The men in black might be monitoring every exit, every street, every security camera. So, what the hell was he supposed to go? Then, it hit him. There was only one place they would not be watching. Some place they'd never dreamed to send him. Somewhere he vowed never to return. But right now, he had no other choice. So he turned left and began running to his brother's house. The past catches up. Daniel's mind wandered as he ran. He hadn't talked to his brother in years, not since it all fell apart. Michael had always been the sensible one, the one who followed rules, the one who said Daniel was wasting his life chasing things that weren't real. Daniel scoffed at the memory. If only he was able to see me now. Michael was the only person he trusted, though. The only person who didn't rat him out. And more importantly, no one who would actually believe him. The neighborhood is not the same. By the time Daniel arrived at his brother's block, the sky had begun to lighten. A dull, gray, pre-dawn light was spreading through the quiet suburban street. It was too quiet. Daniel's pulse spiked. Something felt off. Michael's home was the same as ever, pristine, regimented, uninhabitable. But the street? The entire neighborhood? It felt abandoned. No porch lights, no early morning joggers, just stillness, like the world was suspended, like the world was holding its breath. Daniel swallowed hard. He got to the front door, hesitated. Then, with one deep breath, he knocked. The door opens, too fast a heartbeat. 2. Then, the door swung open, too fast, like Michael had been waiting there for him, as if he had known Daniel was coming. Daniel's chest tightened. Michael stood in the door, unreadable, older than Daniel remembered, sharper, more tired. His gaze darted to the Chihuahua, then back to Daniel. And in the silence that lasted, Michael said something that made the blood freeze in Daniel's veins. "You should not have come here, Danny." Daniel's stomach dropped. His brother knew. Not just about him. not just about the dog, but about everything. And that meant Daniel was racing toward answers, but he may have simply walked right into a trap. Daniel's stomach dropped. The way Michael said it, calm, resigned, as if he had been expecting it, like he had some idea of what was going on. Daniel tightened his grip on the Chihuahua. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, his voice sharper than he had meant it to be. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he drew back, stepped aside, leaving the door ajar. An invitation, or a trap. Every instinct Daniel had told him to run, but he was out of options, so taking a deep breath, he walked in. The house feels wrong. The moment the door closed behind him, the air shifted. The house was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet you find in the dead of night. The type of quiet that was deliberate, artificial, like the house itself could hear. Daniel's eyes darted around. Nothing looked out of place. Same furniture, same pictures on the wall, the same childhood home they used to sneak into when their parents weren't watching. And yet, something felt different. Daniel faced Michael again. "How did you know I was coming?" Michael didn't blink. "Because they're looking for you, Danny." The unexpected revelation he never saw coming. He felt his chest constrict. "You mean the government? The guys in black suits?" Michael's jaw clenched. He nodded, but his face was far away, like he was selecting his words with precision. Daniel's pulse spiked. "Michael, what do you know?" His brother sighed. And then he turned and strolled to the living room. "You should sit down." Daniel didn't move. He wasn't playing this game. No more waiting. No more secrets. "You sensed something was up before I even knocked. You're going to tell me all of it." Michael turned and gave an unreadable expression. Then he pointed at the Chihuahua. "It's not about you, Danny." Daniel blinked. Michael's eyes darkened. "It's about him." They knew all along. Michael walked to a cabinet and took out a folder that he opened. Old, worn at the edges. Something in Daniel's gut said he wasn't going to like whatever was in there. Michael handed it to him. Daniel hesitated, then opened it. And what he saw left him shaken to the core. Photos, dozens of them, some in black and white, some color. They all showed the same thing. Tiny dogs, Chihuahuas mostly, some hooked up to machines, some in metal cages, and in every single photo, the same glowing eyes. Daniel felt a dry knot tighten in his throat. "No," Michael exhaled. "Danny, this shit didn't start with you, or that dog. It started decades ago." The truth about Project Dawn. Daniel turned the page. More documents, official government files, stamped classified. Michael pointed to a paragraph with his finger. "Project Dawn," he read, "a secret program focused on biological enhancement employing—" Daniel stopped reading. He felt sick. "Dogs," he whispered. Michael nodded. "Not just any dogs, dogs like him." He gestured toward the Chihuahua, now curled up in his arms, watching quietly. "They were designed for something greater, Danny. Something they never had a chance to complete." Daniel's mind raced. They were being created by the government, enhancing them. And then, something had gone wrong. "If they've had this program for so long," Daniel muttered, "why hasn't it ended?" Michael's expression became cold. "Because they never stopped it." The reason they want him back. Daniel tightened his grip on the file. "So why does everybody pretend that this dog is special? If they had made dozens of them, why him?" Michael hesitated. Then he said something that broke everything Daniel thought he knew. "Because he's the last one standing." Daniel's breath caught. "What?" Michael returned the file, turning the page. More documents, more photos, but these were different. These ones showed dead dogs, dozens of them, all numbered test subjects, 001, 002, 003, all the way up to 009. Daniel's stomach churned. Where's 010? Michael met his gaze. You're holding him. The last of his kind. Daniel gazed down at the Chihuahua. The small dog looked up at him with blinking eyes. Calm, knowing, like he had already known what he was. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine. What happened to the other ones? He asked quietly. Michael hesitated. Then he closed the file. They didn't make it. Daniel swallowed. Why? Michael's jaw tensed. Because they weren't just experiments, Danny. They were weapons. Daniel's chest tightened. Weapons for what? Michael exhaled sharply. So, he turned to look out the window. For a war. Daniel's pulse spiked. A war with who? Michael's voice was low, serious. Not who. He turned slowly back toward Daniel. His eyes were grim. Michael's words hung over the air like a storm waiting to burst. He felt his pulse beating heavy on his forehead. His brother wasn't dramatic. He wasn't a riddle kind of guy. So, if he was saying this, it meant something real. Something Daniel wasn't expecting. The last weapon, Daniel glanced at the Chihuahua on the ground. The little dog looked up at him, ears up, eyes bright. Like he knew what each word said. As if he had been anticipating this moment. Daniel's grip tightened. You said it was weapons, he muttered. Weapons for what? Michael sighed and rubbed his temple. Not what, Danny? When? Daniel frowned. That doesn't make sense. Michael had his chin up, eyes dark. They weren't building these dogs to fight a war that already was going on. His voice lowered. They were making them for a war that hasn't occurred yet. Daniel's stomach twisted. Project Dawn was never completed. Michael grabbed another file from the cabinet and threw it down on the table. Daniel paused before opening it. More documents, more photos. But these were different. Blueprints, schematics, formations for more than just dogs. Daniel's eyes widened. What the hell am I looking at? Michael's jaw tightened. Phase 2 of Project Dawn. Daniel scanned the pages, and there were a lot of notes scratched out. Words that sent shivers down his spine. Bioautomation incomplete. Cognitive evolution, 0 advancement made. Subject 010 displays anomalous adaptation, and then a phrase that was 3 underlined. Awaiting signal. Daniel's throat went dry. Signal for what? Michael hesitated. Then he turned the page, and Daniel heard the air escape his lungs. The sky is watching. It was a satellite image, taken years ago. At first, it appeared to be nothing, just space, stars, darkness. But there, in the corner of the frame, a shape, not a planet, not an asteroid, something else, something watching. And right beneath it, a date. Today. Daniel's chest tightened. Tell me, this is a joke. Michael didn't answer, but there really was nothing to say. They never intended to create a weapon. Daniel stepped back, his mind whirling. This doesn't make sense. So if they were building these dogs to shut it down for war, why did they shut it down? Michael exhaled. Because they noticed that they were late. Daniel frowned. Too late for what? Michael's eyes darkened. Too late to stop it. Daniel's breath hitched. Michael pointed toward the Chihuahua. They weren't creating an army, Danny. They were constructing a defense. Daniel's mind reeled. Everything he thought he knew about this dog, about all of this, was wrong. They weren't making weapons. They were making guardians, defenders of something they knew was coming. And now, the last one in Daniel's arms, crack in the code and the key comes patching in. Daniel turned to the Chihuahua. The tiny dog tilted his head, still quiet, still watching. And Daniel knew he was waiting, not for Daniel, not for Michael, for something else, for the thing they were created to battle. And then it happened. The house shook. A low, vibrating hum echoed through the air. The lights flickered. Daniel turned away to face the window, and in the sky above, a single bright light shone, moving, descending. It was here, what Project Dawn had been waiting for, the thing that the government had been too slow to prevent. And the final guardian to confront it was a tiny Chihuahua. Daniel's chest tightened. The light in the sky pulsed, not like a star, not like a plane, like something alive. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't blink, because all he could do was raise his arms. This was their fear. This is what the Chihuahua was put here to prevent, and now it was finally here. The Chihuahua reacts first. A low hum sounded in the air, not from the house, not from the sky, from the Chihuahua. Daniel sensed it before he heard it. A low, throbbing hum, like the sound of an idling engine, like something within the dog was coming alive. The little body of the Chihuahua stiffened. His eyes once again shone, dark and round. But this time, they weren't white, they were gold. Daniel staggered back. Oh, hell no. Then the dog moved. The Chihuahua's power swells. The Chihuahua was in Daniel's arms one moment. The next, he was hovering, not jumping, not floating, levitating. A full 3 feet above the ground. His minute fingers opened a bit. His fur crackled with invisible power. And then, the air warped around him. Daniel felt it instantly. When the temperature disappeared, the sound of the walls straining against pressure unseen, and sitting back the way Michael did, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, like he had just witnessed exactly what he dreaded. "It's starting," Michael said under his breath. Daniel's stomach twisted. "What's starting?" Then a voice spoke in his mind. Not Michael's, not his own, the Chihuahua's. "They've arrived." The sky opens. Daniel froze. The Chihuahua was talking, not barking, not making sounds, speaking, inside Daniel's head, like the agents had, like the visions had, and then the entire house shook. The windows rattled hood-rattly. The lights blinked, then went out. And outside, the sky split open, not thunder, not lightning, something worse. A crack, a physical tear, split the night sky, and through it moved something. Daniel's breath hitched. No. Because this wasn't human. What comes through the sky? A shadow swept through the rift. Not a ship, not a meteor, something massive, something watching. Daniel couldn't make out specifics, but he sensed them. It made the air itself feel as if it were crushed under its presence. His lungs tightened, his vision blurred. Every instinct in his body told him to run, but he couldn't, because the Chihuahua would not move. He was staring right at it, his lighted gold eyes transfixed on the top thing, as if he had been waiting for it, as if he knew exactly what it was. And then he spoke again. "It's not here to invade." Daniel felt his pulse spike. "Then what is it?" The Chihuahua blinked. "It's here because to see who's left." The horror behind Project Dawn. Michael made his way over to Daniel, his chest tightening. "You had a feeling this was coming, right?" Michael didn't speak, didn't move, just watch the sky, as a man would watch his worst fear come true. Daniel's breath hitched. "Michael!" Finally, his brother exhaled. "We weren't the first one, Danny." Daniel froze. "What?" Michael swallowed hard. "We weren't the first civilization they visited." The words hit Daniel like a freight train. Michael's voice lowered. Project Dawn was never a creation of the government that was fighting something. His hands curled into fists. They invented this because they know what happens when we lose. The visions return. Daniel's head spun. He heard what Michael was saying, just barely, because the minute those words came out of his mouth, Daniel saw it. Visions, not his own, from behind the past Poca Inn, planets, cities, entire civilizations exterminated. Not by war, not by bombs, by something else, by what was coming now. And Project Dawn, it wasn't an experiment. It was a final effort to prepare. And Daniel, he was not some captive in the middle. He held the final hope in his hands. The final warning, the crack in the sky widened. The air was thick with static. Michael put a hand on Daniel's shoulder, his voice strained. "We don't have much time." Daniel's pulse spiked. "What do we do?" Michael's jaw clenched. "You have to let him go." Daniel's breath caught. "What?" Michael's eyes bored into his. "He never was supposed to stay hidden, Danny. He was meant to fight." Daniel looked down. The Chihuahua stared back, calm, waiting. And Daniel realized he wasn't scared, because this was his moment in time for whom he was made. The sky pulsed again. Tremors rocked the ground beneath them, and Daniel knew he had one choice left. He could hold on to the past, or he could let the Chihuahua fulfill its destiny. And as the first tendrils of light and darkness gleamed through the sky, Daniel finally understood. This wasn't a case of preempting an invasion. This was about survival. The sky cracked open. The thing on the other side, watching, waiting, was really here. Daniel's body locked up. His mind told him to run, to hide, to fight, but it was too late. He wasn't going to win this battle. This was not even a contest for humans. This was about something older, something bigger, and the Chihuahua knew it. The final choice, the little dog floated in front of Daniel. His golden eyes burned. His tiny body throbbed with power. Daniel could feel it, a force larger than anything he could comprehend. This dog was never just a dog. He was the last of them. The final bit of a war we forgot. The last line of defense against what had preceded it, and what was coming again. And now, he had one last choice: to stay, or to end this. Daniel's throat tightened. Wait! But the Chihuahua was on the move. The ascent into the sky. He rose. Not jumping, not flying, just rising. The air around him warped and bent. The clouds swirled angrily overhead. The crack in the sky widened, and for the first time, Daniel could see beyond it. Something massive, something watching. A force that wasn't human, wasn't what Earth had ever faced before. And yet, the Chihuahua didn't flinch. He went toward it. The final words. Daniel heard a voice in his mind. The Chihuahua's voice. "You were nice to me, Daniel." His chest tightened. "I wore a mask, and you didn't know what I was, but you protected me anyway." Tears stung in Daniel's eyes. "Come back," he pleaded. "Don't do this." But the little Chihuahua just smiled. "It's okay." Then he reached the light. The sacrifice. As soon as the Chihuahua set foot in the rift, everything exploded. A shockwave rippled through the air. Brilliant golden light bathed the sky. The strike knocked Daniel to the ground. His ears rang, his vision burned, and then, as abruptly as it had opened, it was over. The sky seals itself. The light faded. The crack in the sky started to close. The entity, the thing that had been watching, waiting, was gone, like it had never been there, like it had been erased. Daniel gasped for air, ragged inhalations. He staggered to his feet. looked up. The sky was whole again, clear, normal, as if nothing ever happened, as though the Chihuahua never existed. Daniel's hands shook. Tears blurred his vision. He parted his lips but couldn't form the words, because deep down he already knew the Chihuahua was gone and he wasn't coming back. The aftermath. Michael stepped over to him, his face grim. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. The Chihuahua had left everything on the field, and the world would never find out. You never know what could have been. You never know what was lurking on the other end. Never know about the little hero who saved them all. But Daniel, he would never forget. One final sign. A gentle breeze whisked past him as he turned away. Warm, gentle, like a whisper, like a farewell. Daniel closed his eyes, and in that silence he heard it. A single bark, faint, distant, but real. A final goodbye. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Daniel let himself smile. Because even though the Chihuahua was lost, he had won.